change to the way that we think is valuable. Quantum computing is an example where science has led to very exciting early part of the industry today, but it is driven by some people who had passion and who was dedicated to making that change happen. It is being shaped into the form that these people actually envision. What I'd like to conclude is the future is not there predetermined for you. And that's the recognition of the 21st century science. What that also means, it's really up to us to create that future, whatever it is. Let's do it right. Because as the impact gets broader more quickly, if we do a lot of damage, it may be very difficult to undo. With that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention and wonderful discussions we had.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you remember when it's the last time and you actually look up the skies? I'm Yang, an astronomer from the KASI, Korea Astronomy and Space Science Institute.
Space.
Astronomers look at something. What?
Maybe alien life?
Trust me, astronomers are very serious about the aliens or Earth 2.0. New Space Telescope PIX. Our knowledge about universe is more colorful. And we just wow mankind's fundamental question, basically where I came from, where I'm going. Secrets of the universe. So let's go on the journey.
Test takers in South Korea wrapped up the annual college entrance exam known as the Suneung on Thursday, a day backed by support from the entire nation. Top diplomats from South Korea and the U.S. met on the sidelines of the Group of 7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada, where U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he would help ensure the joint fact sheet on the two countries' trade and security agreements was released at an early date. The longest shutdown of the U.S. federal government in history came to an end on Wednesday local time after President Donald Trump signed a funding bill to get the country working again. Suneung Day 2025 here in South Korea, where mostly high school seniors take the country's annual college entrance exam, has ended. A marathon of more than 9 hours of exams will determine their next steps in life. But before anything, these test takers are ready to enjoy a bit of freedom. Our An Sung-jin starts us off.
The long journey has come to an end. As students began to pour out after the 9-hour marathon national college entrance exam, also known as the Suneung, some had expressions of excitement on their faces, while some looked worried as friends and families greeted them.
It was a bit more difficult than what I practiced with, so I was a bit startled, but at least I'm done with it. I want to travel abroad or use the test paper discounts to have fun.
I want to allow myself to have a lot of rest. I think I did fine in the morning, but I'm not sure about the afternoon. I just want to go home and sleep, though I still have an interview to prepare for.
For many students here in South Korea, having a good score in the Suneung is something to strive for, as it could decide their next steps in life. This year, more than 550,000 students took the test at nearly 1,300 test centers across the nation. The number of test takers for this year was the highest in 7 years, though the number of those retaking the exam was slightly decreased, partly due to the reversal of plans to expand the medical school quota. To properly assess test takers' knowledge in line with the public education curriculum, the exam committee ensured a balanced distribution of questions with appropriate difficulty.
We excluded questions that would favor those trained in private education and focused on core and fundamental elements of the public school education.
A team of on-site teachers evaluated that this year's exam would have likely been perceived as slightly more challenging compared to last year's, as questions designed to differentiate top-performing students were somewhat more difficult. As the sun set on this year's Suneung Day, the students of 2025 have truly earned their rest after a series of subjects, starting off with Korean language, continuing through with math, English, and elective subjects. For many, the day marked not just the end of an exam, but the beginning of a new chapter, a well-earned rest after years of effort. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
And Suneung Day wasn't just a big day for test takers. From police, taxi drivers to parents, the entire nation rolled up its sleeves to cheer for the country's next generation. Our Kim Do-yeon has his story.
A police car arrives in a hurry. Opening the back door, coming out is not a detained suspect. Rather, it's a test taker for this year's Suneung, or the national once-a-year college entrance exam. This is one of 234 examples of police support or escorts that happen on Thursday morning to make sure examinees are not late to take the test, as they have to report by 8:10. Even this accident on a highway early in the morning couldn't stop the police from escorting. The truck blocked the lanes in one direction completely, and a test taker called for help. Police located them and weaved through the traffic, and later said that the caller arrived early to the designated test center about 50 kilometers away. Not only the police, but taxis have helped out with the escorts as well.
I'm supporting them like they're my grandchildren.
At the test centers are juniors cheering for their seniors to perform their best. And just as much as the test takers themselves, parents feel the pressure and nervousness. Hugs are seen at the entrance as the kids take one of their first steps into adulthood.
I'm really nervous as well, but my son will feel more pressure. I hope he doesn't get nervous, since he prepared well.
With this exam once a year and the societal pressure, prayers and tears are also seen as the kids enter the 8-hour test marathon with 12 years of education leading up to this day. And with this, the whole nation's support reflects its sincere support for the test takers who are the nation's next generation. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
In other news, the top diplomats of the 7 wealthiest democracies held a foreign ministers meeting in Canada on Wednesday. And now, on the sidelines of the meeting, South Korean and U.S. diplomats met, reportedly having discussed the need to promptly release the joint fact sheet. Our Kim Bo-kyung tells us more.
Amid the delayed announcement of a joint fact sheet outlining the outcome of the recent summit between President Lee Jae-myung and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump, the two countries' top diplomats had a brief meetup on Wednesday local time on the sidelines of the Group of 7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada. According to the Foreign Ministry on Thursday, Foreign Minister Cho Hyun has asked U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio to help speed up the release of the joint fact sheet, so that the matters agreed upon during the summit can be concretely implemented. Secretary Rubio reportedly said he would actively communicate with the relevant government agencies to help ensure that the fact sheets can be released as soon as possible. The two governments are reportedly at odds over where South Korea would build nuclear-powered submarines, with Seoul maintaining its stance that it should be done in-country, while U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and others reportedly argue that it should take place in the U.S., viewing it as an extension of the Korea-U.S. shipbuilding cooperation. Meanwhile, the top diplomats of G7 countries reaffirmed their commitment to the complete denuclearization of North Korea. In a joint statement, they condemned Pyongyang's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, reaffirmed commitment to the regime's complete denuclearization, and expressed grave concerns over the North's cryptocurrency thefts, and urged it to resolve the abductions issue expeditiously. When it comes to the Ukraine war, that statement reaffirmed unwavering support for Ukraine. The top diplomats condemned North Korea and Iran for providing Russia with military assistance and China for providing weapons and dual-use components. 김보경, Arirang News.
South Korea may be heading into one of its most sweeping policy overhauls in years. President Lee Jae-myung told his aides today that structural reforms are essential to reviving the country's sluggish economy. Our presidential office correspondent Song Yujin has the details.
President Lee Jae-myung has signaled that bold structural reforms are on the way next year.
경제 회복의 불씨가 켜진 지금이 바로 구조개혁의 적기라고 판단이 됩니다. 정부는 내년이 본격적 구조개혁을 통한 대한민국 국가 대전환의 출발점이 될 수 있도록 관련된 준비를 철저하고 속도감 있게 준비해야 되겠습니다.
At a weekly meeting with his top aides on Thursday, President Lee said such reforms are essential to address what he described as South Korea's biggest challenge, the steady decline in its potential growth rate.
정권마다 1%씩 잠재 성장률이 떨어져가지고 곧 마이너스로 좀 갈 수도 있는 그런 상황입니다. 혈관에 찌꺼기가 쌓이면 좋은 영양분을 섭취해도 건강이 좋아지지 않는 것처럼 이 사회 전반의 문제를 방치하면 어떤 정책도 제 효과를 낼 수 없기 때문입니다.
To restore long-term growth, Lee has outlined 6 areas for overhaul: regulation, finance, the public sector, pensions, education, and labor, priorities shaped by the administration's first 5 months in office. According to presidential spokesperson Kim Nam-jun, detailed plans for each of these reforms will be announced later, as Thursday's meeting focused on reviewing the current situation and setting the overall direction. Lee placed particular emphasis on the labor sector, stressing that fatal workplace accidents, many of them preventable, must come to an end.
기업들도 이 안전이라고 하는 문제를 줄여야 될 비용이라는 측면에서 접근할 게 아니고 당연히 늘려가야 될 투자다라는 인식을 갖춰야 할 겁니다. 관계 부처들이 겨울철 위험 사업장에 대한 안전 점검도 서두르도록 조치해 주시기 바랍니다.
The president's comments come after the collapse of a boiler tower in the city of Ulsan last week, which left at least 6 workers dead and 1 still missing, and has reignited concerns over workplace safety here in the country. Song Yujin, Arirang News.
Amidst a moderately growing yet complex global economy, South Korea's expected recovery faces widely divergent forecasts, primarily influenced by the looming impact of U.S. tariffs. For more on this, we have our economics correspondent Moon Ji-young here in the studio. Hello, Ji-young.
Good evening, Dami.
So, Ji-young, let's start with the 2026 outlook for the global economic picture. What are the main projections and potential risks?
Well, the 2026 global economic picture, as framed by the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, is one of a buffered slowdown amid an asymmetric world. This implies a global economy with no clear common direction, exhibiting differing trends across regions, even as nations partially mitigate economic shocks. The state-run institute projects the global economy to grow by 3% in 2026, matching this year's pace. This represents a 0.1 percentage point upward revision from the institute's previous forecast made in May. A major downside risk is the rapid shift in the new tariff and trade order. The impact of U.S. tariffs slows global trade volume growth, weakening the multilateral trading system.
As countries with a high dependency on trade will find it difficult to avoid pressure from reduced exports due to worsening external conditions, this uncertainty in the trade sector is one of the most significant downside risks.
Additional risks include weakened physical capacity and disruptions from imbalanced AI investment. Regionally, growth rates vary. As tariffs dampen consumer sentiment, the U.S. economy is forecast to grow by 1.6%. The Eurozone is projected to grow by 1.1% and Japan by 0.6%. Among emerging markets, China's growth is expected to moderate to 4.2%, slowed by the 2025 base effect and ongoing trade conflicts. Amidst moderate forecasts and risks, Kiev emphasizes critical international cooperation for navigating the asymmetric era, despite limited policy options.
So there's that for the global outlook. Now let's look domestically. What's the outlook for the Korean economy next year, especially with its changing growth, key growth drivers?
While the South Korean economy is expected to expand modestly at 1.8% next year, driven by domestic demand as U.S. tariffs take their toll on exports. This is according to the Korea Development Institute, which anticipates a significant shift in growth drivers from exports to domestic demand.
The growth of exports may gradually decelerate as the impact of tariff hikes progressively spreads. However, with consumption improving due to falling market interest rates and expansionary fiscal policies, accumulated construction orders are expected to partially translate into construction investment with a time lag. Consequently, despite the slowdown in export growth, the economy is anticipated to see a moderate improvement, primarily driven by domestic demand.
The state-run institute anticipates private consumption to rise by 1.6%, buoyed by falling market interest rates and expansionary fiscal policy. Construction investment is projected to rebound to 2.2% growth after a severe 9.1% contraction this year. Despite this anticipated shift, KDI flags high trade uncertainty and a persistently high exchange rate as primary risks, potentially fueling inflation.
Now, Jiyoung, many other institutions at home and abroad offer quite varying predictions for 2026. What would really explain this?
Well, indeed, the Korean economy is expected to see a moderate recovery next year, but Trump's tariffs mean differing growth forecasts between different institutions. While there's a general expectation for recovery, potentially doubling this year's average growth rate, predictions still vary substantially. Major domestic and international institutions project Korea's economic growth rate for 2026 to be between 1.6% and 2.2%. At the more optimistic end, the OECD and major global investment banks project 2.2% growth. Their positive outlook is largely attributed to recent better-than-expected export performance. In the mid-range, both the KDI and the IMF present their respective forecasts. On the more conservative side, the Asian Development Bank and the Bank of Korea forecast 1.6% growth. This creates a 0.6 percentage point gap between the highest and lowest projections. The primary reason for this significant difference lies in how each institution evaluates the potential impact of U.S. tariffs.
Right now, especially because of the Trump administration, a lot of things are very unsure. So a lot of people are making some assumptions about what will happen next year, which may or may not become true. And that's making a wide dispersion of growth estimates for next year, more than what we usually see.
However, a common consensus emerges amidst these varied forecasts and uncertainties. The recovery of domestic demand, suggesting internal economic engines will gradually pick up despite external volatility.
Hopefully. All right, Jiyoung, thanks for coming in tonight.
Thank you for having me, Dami.
We now turn to the National Assembly, where lawmakers here in South Korea cleared a busy agenda, passing numerous bills while preparing for high-profile votes and important legislation later this month. Our Moon Hae-ryun tells us more.
Lawmakers in South Korea wrapped up a packed parliamentary session on Thursday, moving swiftly through a slate of non-controversial bills while also reporting a high-profile arrest motion. More than 50 livelihood-related bills were passed in roughly 2 hours, following an agreement reached between the ruling Democratic Party and the main opposition People Power Party before the session. Among the bills were education-related measures, including stronger penalties for university admissions officers who fail to step aside when conflicts of interest arise, amendments to the Last Mile Logistics Industry Development Act, which strengthens protection for delivery workers, and changes to the Motor Vehicle Management Act aimed at preventing electric vehicle fires. The motion to arrest People Power Party lawmaker Chu Kyung-ho was also reported during today's session. He has been accused of obstructing last December's parliamentary vote to lift the emergency martial law order, and in response, Chu is calling the investigation politically motivated. The next plenary session is scheduled for the 27th, where lawmakers will vote on the arrest motion for former PPP floor leader Chu Kyung-ho and finalize negotiations on fast-track bills still pending agreement. These fast-track bills include a new act aimed at strengthening the competitiveness of South Korea's semiconductor industry, which establishes a related committee under the president, as well as amendments to an act guaranteeing the right of franchises to collective bargaining. Fast-track designation allows urgent bills to skip normal committee reviews and go straight to a plenary session for a vote. Thursday's plenary session also included appointments to the Nuclear Safety and Security Commission, recommended by the People Power Party and the Speaker of the National Assembly. Other appointments requiring parliamentary approval, such as those to the Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission, National Education Commission, and Human Rights Commission, will be addressed at the session later this month. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
America will resume all federal services after a record shutdown of 43 days, as lawmakers narrowly voted to pass a short-term government funding bill. President Donald Trump sealed the deal on Wednesday night. Our Suneung has the details.
Ending the longest shutdown of federal services in U.S. history, President Donald Trump on Wednesday local time signed a short-term funding bill to reopen the government.
And it's an honor now to sign this incredible bill and get our country working again. Thank you.
This came after the House of Representatives voted 222 to 209 to pass a compromise bill advanced by the Senate on Monday to extend government funding through January 30th. The bill brings back hundreds of thousands of federal workers, resuming major public services from issuing food stamps to managing national parks and air traffic control. However, the package remains a short-term fix, not a resolution, with most Democrats remaining opposed to the bill. At the heart of the deadlock that led to the record 43-day shutdown, the biggest point of contention had been the Republicans' exclusion of healthcare subsidies, which millions of Americans rely on. One Democrat said the fight is not over.
We will continue to fight to lower the high cost of living. House Democrats will continue to fight to address the health care crisis that Republicans have created. And House Democrats will continue to fight to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits for tens of millions of Americans. This fight is not over. We're just getting started.
While Senate Majority Leader John Suneung promised to hold a vote in his chamber on an extension by December 12th, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has made no such assurances, rather blaming Democrats for the government shutdown's fallout.
Absolutely no question in anybody's mind now that the Democrats were responsible for this. They openly admitted, many of them said it in their own words, that they used the American people as leverage in this political game.
With the political standoff expected to stretch on, Congress faces yet another funding deadline for January 30th. Observers say if negotiations stall again, the risk of another shutdown early next year remains very real. Suneung, Arirang News.
The world's fossil fuel emissions will hit a new record in 2025, according to the largest global carbon balance report. Researchers at the Global Carbon Project have predicted the nations will emit roughly 38.1 billion tons of planet-warming carbon dioxide this year for burning oil, gas, and coal for energy. Emissions appear to stay nearly flat in China due to its transition to renewable energy, while rising significantly in the U.S. and the European Union. The data presented in the report confirmed that it is unrealistic to limit global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. NewJeans may be on the verge of returning, with ADOR already finalizing discussions with members Hain and Hedin ahead of tonight's legal deadline. The agency is now preparing separate talks with the remaining 3 members, raising expectations of controversy for a complete comeback. Suneung has more.
After a year-long contract dispute, the likelihood grows of NewJeans returning as a full 5-member group. A key deadline comes at midnight on Thursday. If the members do not file an appeal by the 14th at 12 a.m., the court's first trial ruling, confirming their exclusive contracts with ADOR are valid, will automatically be finalized. All 5 members have expressed intent to return. ADOR has already completed prior consultations with Hain and Hedin, who decided to respect the court's ruling and follow through with their contracts. The agency is now arranging separate meetings with Minji, Hani, and Danielle, who announced their return just hours after ADOR confirmed the first 2 members' comeback. The 3 members released their statement independently, while ADOR noted that it is confirming their intentions, signaling a different tone compared to the earlier pair. Former ADOR CEO Min Hee-jin also addressed the developments. In a statement released on Thursday, Min said she respects and supports the members' decision to return, adding that she values the courage of the members who joined hands once again to protect each other. Once the appeal deadline passes, the agency is expected to sit down with all 3 to align on the next steps. Discussions are likely to mirror the earlier case, centering on upholding the court's decision and rebuilding a working relationship inside a company now operating without former CEO Min Hee-jin. With the legal process nearing its conclusion, ADOR now faces the task of rebuilding communication within the team and establishing a stable framework for NewJeans' full group activities. Suneung, Arirang News.
For the National College Entrance Exam, the whole country continued to be generally clear without any cool spells. Even though the morning started chilly, the temperature warmed up quickly in the afternoon. It exceeded the previous year's temperature by 3 to 5 degrees, reaching 17 degrees in Seoul and 18 degrees in Daegu and Daejeon. With mild conditions, dusty air come up as a problem again. The concentration of ultra-fine dust will rise to bad levels even during the night and will be bad tomorrow morning around some eastern and southern parts of the country. Most areas will start off in the single digits tomorrow morning, with Seoul at 3 degrees, Gyeongju at 4 degrees. Daily highs will rise up to 13 degrees in Seoul and Chuncheon, 16 degrees in Daegu. After rain stops on Sunday, the temperatures will plummet sharply and freezing cold weather will come around. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
Korea, a globally recognized sports powerhouse. Behind the dazzling achievements, there's always an invisible force at work. With sophisticated materials, cutting-edge equipment, and innovative technological solutions, SMEs in the K-sports industry play a vital role in bolstering Korea's status as a sports powerhouse. By integrating AI technology, they unlock athletes' potential and enhance performance, elevating the sports environment to the next level and opening new markets in the sports industry. Their innovative technology and bold challenges drive the growth of Korea's sports industry, creating a better world through sports. The innovation of these SMEs never stops. A systematic partnership support program is implemented to discover promising sports SMEs, provide technical validation and R&D support to enhance competitiveness, and strengthen the foundation for overseas expansion. At Tokyo Sportech 2025, the technological prowess of Korean companies was recognized. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, and the Korea Sports Promotion Foundation supported K-sports companies with product promotion and business consultations with global buyers, demonstrating product quality and market potential, and confirming the possibility of expanding into the global market.
저희는 ICT 강국으로서 바이어나 사용자들한테 신기술을 접목한 생활 스포츠 기회를 실질적으로 확대할 수 있는 그 기회를 제공하는데 많은 도움이 될 수 있으리라고 확신을 합니다.
이제 스포츠도 K죠. K 스포츠는 이겁니다.
The joy for all, created by the power of K-sports. Experience the future of the new sports industry through the innovation and technology of the Korean sports industry.
Knock knock! The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Pony Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Ping Fong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like the total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imaginations. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gan. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, a milestone that comes with both reflection and urgency. COP30 has opened in Brazil, where over 190 countries are gathering to push climate action forward. While the absence of the U.S. under President Donald Trump raises questions about global unity, China is making bold moves to assert leadership. Climate shocks are becoming more visible, from food supply disruptions to ecosystem stress. And against this backdrop, South Korea has finalized a new 2035 target, aiming to cut emissions by up to 61% from 2018 levels. The focus now shifts to how countries will translate these commitments into credible, coordinated, and lasting solutions. For more on this, we connect to Yoon Jin-ho, professor at the School of Earth Sciences and Environmental Engineering at Gwangju Institute of Science and Technology. A big welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us from California is David Victor, a distinguished professor of innovation and public policy at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's begin our discussion first with Professor Yoon, the bigger picture first. So this year's COP30 opens at a very critical moment for global climate action. Could you tell our viewers what distinguishes this year's summit from previous ones, especially since it marks the 10 years anniversary since the Paris Agreement?
Yes, as mentioned, it's been 10 years. So the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. So this COP30 is just not only just reaffirmations, but also we have to think about what we have done and what we need to do in the futures. So they are likely to expected to what has or has not been achieved, and we really have to ask ourselves, where do we go from here to 2030s or 2050s? And also, it's 10 years after Paris. So that means the window to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees becomes narrower and narrower. So the expectation, I hope that there is a shifting from, what we would do to achieve the 2030, 2050 goal, or, the real things, how we deliver but these things by 2030s or even beyond. And also the location, the host nation is Brazil, and then the location is in the middle of Amazons, which I hope that it adds some focus onto the forest and the nature dimensions, so that the negotiators hope that they focus much more toward tropical forest protections, biodiversity, indigenous rights, nature-based solutions, and land use. And all those issues are important. We just really have to, step forward to how we deliver these things, in a practical sense. And then, so in that regard, I hope that it will be emphasized much more on implementations and indicators or measurements, meaning that how things has to be done and how we actually make that happen, without talking about some political, pushbacks and force. We have to find some ways that how each nations do it. So those are indicators, how actually they are not doing well. So we have to find a way to boost those areas that the countries are not so well doing things. And then we need to have some kind of a well-adapted measurements that the CO2 emissions, measuring those CO2 emissions. And I hope that we go toward those areas in this COP30s.
Right, definitely. Let's hope for some meaningful results coming out of it. Now, another notable event for this year was that the U.S. President Donald Trump exited the Paris Agreement and skipped COP30 altogether. Professor Victor, how does this affect the tone and trajectory of global climate diplomacy right now?
Well, I mean, it's not helpful. to have the world's biggest economy not there and obnoxious about the climate change agenda. Everyone expected this was going to happen. During the first Trump administration, it took them a while to figure out that there was a Paris Agreement and that they should leave, and so they left. This time they left on the first day, or they issued the documents to leave on the first day, which meant that they're going to leave exactly a year later. It takes a while for the formal process to run its course. So it's unhelpful in the sense that other countries are asking themselves, why should we spend a lot of money on something like climate change if the United States is not doing that? You look back in history, the key roles for creating the Paris Agreement were played in part by the United States. The key roles for the first big conference after the Paris Agreement, which was so-called COP26 in Glasgow, the United States and the Biden administration played a very central role in bringing together a bunch of companies along with governments. That was very important. And so the absence of the United States will be felt. I will say the United States is not completely absent. The federal government's not there and not saying very nice things. Some of the states are there. I live in California, where it's dark right now. The governor of California is there. He's kind of a rock star because there's no federal presence. And so there's a lot of attention to how the rest of the American society is still kind of in, even though the Trump administration is out. I guess the last thing I'd say about this is it could be worse. It could be that they were there. Many of the formal decisions at these conferences are taken by consensus. And so if you have a big country that doesn't want progress, they can cause a lot of trouble. And we've run that experiment. About a month ago at the International Maritime Organization, the Trump administration was there, active. They were hostile to the agenda, in particular around the agenda on climate change and shipping. And so they worked to block the adoption of a pretty well-reasoned climate change program for the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. So we've seen this, and I think the rest of the world is happy not to have them there formally, unhappy not to have the American contribution that would normally be present if a different administration were in power.
So its absence is symbolic, but it doesn't really block the progress from going. But on the flip side, Professor Victor, China is stepping in. China has set aggressive 2035 emission targets and is visibly positioning itself as a climate leader there. So given the scale of this domestic emissions and its investments in green tech abroad, how do you evaluate the credibility and the intent behind China's global climate posture?
Well, I think credibility is the key word in your question, because it's very easy to make pledges. And we've seen, as Professor Yoon said, we're waiting to see what comes out of this conference. We have lots of pledges this round. This conference, we're going to see a new round. Almost all governments are going to issue new pledges of things they're going to do, what are called nationally determined contributions. Which should we believe? Which shouldn't we believe? The Chinese role is really interesting, and it's part of this hypothesis that action on climate change continues even when there's geopolitical tension. And the most interesting part about the Chinese role is this just tremendous investment in clean tech. They see this as the future of one of the future engines of the economy. It's a strategic priority. They've just put together a new 5-year plan that starts next year. Clean tech innovation and deployment is at the center of that plan. They're still burning a lot of coal, as your video clips are showing here, but they're also doing a lot of solar, wind, electric vehicles, batteries, on and on and on. And one of the reasons that these technologies are now so competitive around the world is because of Chinese manufacturing. So in the sense of what's the credibility of the Chinese statements, the credibility that they're going to be major players in clean tech, and that's positive for the green revolution, that's absolutely true. Will they meet their emission pledges? That's hard to say. But I think what's clear is that they're doing stuff to bend down the curve, that their emissions trajectory is not as high as it had been, say, 15, 20 years ago. And in fact, many analysts now think that we've seen peak coal consumption in China, that even though they're using a lot of coal, that the total coal consumption in China has now reached its peak and is going to begin declining as they replace old coal plants with new efficient coal plants, as they switch from coal to nuclear and to renewables of various types, maybe to natural gas and some other energy sources. So the overall picture, I think, is mixed, but the Chinese role is very, very impressive and frankly pretty reliable.
So China's role does seem more layered than it appears, and we'll look forward to their contributions then. But this actually brings us to the question of climate finance. Advanced economies have fallen short of their climate finance pledges. Professor Yoon, what mechanisms or frameworks are realistically needed to close the funding gap for developing nations?
So the climate finance is something that under the Paris Agreement, the developed countries are promised to deliver a certain amount of the U.S. the financial resources to the developing countries to help them to mitigate and adaptations, and that hopefully will cut down the CO2 emissions, and then we achieve our global goals. But then the numbers, whether that's $300 billion per year or $1 trillion per year, the promise by the developed countries are always kind of fall behind what's actually talked about in the agreement. And then also developing countries want more for sure. So every price is going up, so that they have to have a more U.S. monies to do what they wanted to do. And so this is one issue. But then there's also another issue, like there's a persistent imbalance between or the kind of a tug of war. Do we have to do the mitigation first, or do we have to do the adaptation first? Because the mitigation, we have to cut the emissions, but also the disasters are coming up in a much bigger scales. So people are suffering. So we have to find some ways to adapt to those new climate conditions. So I don't know exactly the answers for the questions, but then we really realistically have to scale up our financial actual monies to the climate actions, and also we have to find some ways to balance mitigations or the adaptations, or which country has to go first. And final thing is that the public sectors has to do a lot. Or they have to do the initiation process. They have to actually put the money into it, but also the private sector has to join. Without private sectors, it's almost impossible to achieve that big numbers in the dollar amount at all. So how do we bring those public sectors into these actions? Then we have to give them some incentive rather than punishment, or some kind of both ways to. But then we really have to lure them into this kind of a new courses. It's not that easy to do so, but it's not only one nation, but a group of nations or the globally. Well, hopefully we can go for positive directions, but it's not that easy for sure that I can say.
Right, definitely. It's a very difficult problem, and many countries are struggling for that. But there could be some countries or policy models that are standing out as effective benchmarks for combining ambition with execution in climate action. Professor Victor, could you tell us on that?
Yeah, so first, there are many kinds of ambition. So a lot of the diplomacy is going to focus on the questions that Professor Yoon was just talking about: finance, more transfers of money to developing countries. In that sense, we're going to have a lot of challenges this year because countries are not feeling very rich. They're not kind of wanting to donate huge amount of money. That's a recipe for political crisis. The ambition that most people are focused on is the ambition to solve the problem, which is controlling emissions. In that sense, the leading model is still basically the European model. Since the early 1990s, the only group of countries that have been really reliable leaders around climate change action have been the Europeans. The United States comes, it goes. The Chinese come and they go. Mostly they're in now, but it's not clear what their total emissions controls are going to be. Other countries are involved here and there, but they don't have the economic heft of the EU or the United States or China. So the Europeans really are the place to watch. And there you have a mixture of pledges that are very ambitious, along with actions to control emissions in Europe. And on top of that, what's called a border adjustment mechanism, where the Europeans have, for some products, now beginning to apply a tariff at the border to correct for the policies that are more aggressive in Europe compared to policies in other countries. So that's creating an incentive for other countries to come along and do more. And so it's not just action that's in Europe, it's action that goes outside Europe. So I think that remains the high watermark here. A lot of other countries are doing interesting things. I continue to be very impressed by the Korean nuclear program and some of the renewables programs. Really amazing what's happening, batteries and so on. The last thing I'll say about this is we have a tendency to think about countries as the unit of analysis, as the unit we want to talk about, because they're the formal parties to the climate convention, and most international politics, we tend to think of countries first. But in a problem like climate change, which is really a problem about technological transformation and changes in the entire society, the right unit to look at is not just countries, but it's industries. Why do we care about this? In the United States, some of the most extraordinary developments are taking place far from the federal government. Think about the data centers that are very much in the news. The biggest users, the 4 biggest users of data centers in the United States, are all willing to pay a lot of extra money, like double the cost of electricity, if they can get clean electricity. That means renewables, that means reopening nuclear plants, that eventually means building new nuclear plants. It means natural gas with a technique they call carbon capture and storage that captures the pollution on the natural gas plants. One of those was just announced by Google in Iowa in the last few weeks. And so you look across the board and you see an industry that, even though they don't face regulation, is going out and doing stuff. And that we're seeing that all around the world in different industries, different speeds, different countries doing different things. And that's, I think, the new world, which is there's no one obvious leader, but you have lots of little pockets of progress here and there. And in places where the technologies are lining up and where the business models are credible, the policies are credible, so that investors can say, hey, we're going to deploy a lot of capital in that. And when they see that opportunity, the investors come in. Last year, worldwide, more than $2 trillion was invested in clean energy, clean industry across the board. That's extraordinary, and that's rising 15% year on year.
Right. Thank you for that explanation. It gives us a clear picture of what's actually working and where we should actually focus on. Now, let's shift gears a little bit now to South Korea. The nation finalized its 2035 NDC aims to cut 53 to 61% of emissions from 2018 levels. Professor Yoon, do you believe this strikes the right balance between ambition and practicality?
Well, I'm not an expert on this particular issue, but after the government announcement, both sides, meaning that the environmental activists and also those guys in the industry, they all complaining. When both sides complaining, I hope that they have to sacrifice certain bit in both sides. So I hope that's, I don't know whether that's the best way, but I hope that they have to compromise in some ways. And it is quite ambitious plan, because given the fact that the former administration didn't do much about this NDC, or their previous NDC was like they put all things back to the behind it. So as of now, they don't need to do anything, or they don't need to do anything seriously. But then this 2035 NDC just announced it, is to put a clear target by 2035. So I hope that the country will shift rather quickly to achieve these goals. And it's the quite upward shift in ambitions. And practically, whether we can actually do it or not, we have to, government has to shift the gears or order their policies, the policy priorities, and to achieve these goals. Like my case, one example I had was like when I do the public lectures, a CEO, a guy, just asked me, because his business will eventually cannot survive under this type of NDC environment, or this new regulatory environment. And he asked me what to do. And I feel, at the moment that when I got the questions, I was really stunned, and it took me quite a while to respond to him. But what I tried to tell him was that this shift in the policy or the environmental regulation is, we already went through something similar. Like in 1970s, Korean industry was a heavily labor-intensive one. But then now we shift all things into more energy, or the chemical engineering side of it, or the semiconductors. So we've been, the economy has been shifting from one direction to another, and then this environmental regulation is kind of a certain things, but it can be outside factors, or it comes down to a new regulation to the most businessmen. But this is, as Professor Victor said, that there are some companies that are trying to move toward that direction, ahead of or even the government are targeting. So we have to, give them some incentive to, change their business into more appropriate to this new carbon reduction industry, or the new kind of business model. So hopefully they can find some ways to shift their business into the new model.
Right. Thank you for your opinion on that. Now, what about Professor Victor, looking beyond the summit, what do you think must happen after COP30, both globally and in Korea, for climate goals to move beyond rhetoric and into real progress?
Well, I think it depends a lot on what actually happens at COP30. If COP30 ends with some of these financing issues resulting in a blow up and no final agreement, which has happened in the past, it happened in 2009. All the governments got together, they spent 2 weeks together, they stayed up all night for a few days in a row, and they couldn't reach agreement. And that blew up the space and opened up the space for new ideas, and that's actually what produced the Paris Agreement, so it's quite helpful. This time, if we had a big failure like that, it might be very harmful, because the Paris Agreement mostly is working. It's working pretty well. It's encouraging the kinds of investments we've been talking about all day, so that's fantastic. But if we have a failure at the conference, we're going to be looking to see what happens, which governments are there, ready to show what they're still doing, why we should still believe in the process, we shouldn't lose faith in the process, and so on. So that's going to be the most important thing if there's a failure. If the conference results in some kind of agreement where nobody's quite sure what they agreed to, but they agreed that they agreed, which is what most diplomacy is about, then the most important things are going to be to continue implementing these pledges that countries have made, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and also, frankly, figuring out how to help the developing countries. One of the most important insights from climate science for decades now has been that the countries that are most exposed to the physical impacts of climate change are the poorest ones, the ones who are least responsible for this. And they're going to need help, because although we're making progress overall in the climate problem, we're not stopping it yet, and we're in for a lot of climate change.
Right, so we'll really have to continue to cooperate and look into the results of how the COP30 concludes. Right, but as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Victor.
Thank you very much.
And Professor Yoon, we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.